Welcome to Measurably Better Learning, the podcast built for learning and development professionals. Whether you're an instructional designer, L&D professional, or corporate leader, get ready for insights and ideas that will transform your approach to learning, training, and development. So let's dive in.
Welcome to this episode of the Measurably Better Learning podcast. I'm your host, Miriam Taylor, and today with me is Dr. Jerry Zanstra. Always a pleasure to have you along.
Good to be with you always, Miriam.
Well, thank you. So we're excited about this conversation. You and I spend a lot of time talking and thinking about this. So our topic for this podcast, and really several more to come, it's going to be a series. We have been thinking about learning science.
Yep.
And so in this episode, I think we just want to think through what is learning science, give our listeners a little bit of an overview. And the word seems simple enough, but what do we really mean when we talk about learning science?
Well, it's not simple. I mean, in fact, we've been talking about it for a long time and thinking about it for a long time. Learning science sounds as if it's one thing, and it's distinct from other sciences and I think this is true in other sciences anyway, but it's actually a subset of other sciences. I think the more descriptive term would be the sciences of learning.
Which is fun to say.
Which is
right off the tongue.
Yeah, no, it's not a really, elegant statement.
No.
But the idea is that the complexity of the human person matches the fact that in studying how human beings learn and develop patterns and habits, it's a complex thing. And our brain is an unbelievably complex thing. I mean, it is the next frontier, right? We talk about space, we talk about deep ocean and the other, quantum physics and quantum mechanics, of course, but how does our brain actually work? And we are very new. Yeah. This is probably 150 years old, which in the entire history of humanity, we're just now thinking, and there may be more questions than there are answers. But what we'll talk about today is how all of those sciences inform learning, and so not just on the theoretical level, but on the practical level.
Yeah, it reminded me actually of a previous podcast where we were talking a little bit about the history of learning, and just prior, to even 200 years, all we really cared about was retention. Right. We didn't understand really how the brain. It was just pound something into someone, right? Like write 100 sentences, whatever it might be, and how far
it wasn't 100 years ago, Miriam. That was fair. Third grade for me. Okay. So
right, but again, like that's. Was the depth of our understanding was really, if we practice enough, we will learn. Yeah. And so learning sciences adds a whole extra depth and just a rich perspective that, like you said, we're just scratching the surface.
Just starting, yeah.
It is complex. If we call it the sciences of learning, or in your opinion, what ones should we, for our conversation, our purposes, what do we need? What are we really talking about?
And it is my opinion, right? It's not fixed, and the number of sciences that you could include, and even the sciences that I'm going to mention have subsciences underneath them.
Right.
And then there's these weird connective tissues between these sciences, but certainly, at least, cognition, right?
Yeah.
Cognitive science has to be part of it. Psychology has to be part of it. Sociology has to be part of it. There has to be a conversation about linguistics.
Sure. Okay.
Through which we're not only learning, but it's the medium through which we think, which is really intriguing. And then I think behavioral sciences. I can't remember if I mentioned consumer sciences already.
Yeah, there
could be. I think all of those inform. There could be others. Maybe. Anthropologists raise their hand and go, wait a minute.
Right.
We need to have a seat at this table. Fine. But we're at least going to talk about those.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the purpose of our conversation too, we don't want to get out over our skis. So, I mean, we start throwing in things that we have no experience or background with. We're going to get a lot of angry emails from real experts.
You don't know what you're talking
That's
about.
Right. So we're a global company, and before we go too much further, I want us to think about that for a minute. Do you think that learning sciences vary by the culture that you're in, or the various cultures?
I think, and again, one person's opinion, the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
You and I in these conversations have both agreed at some point we believe that human beings are wired to learn. It is, if you think of, we are hardwired that way. It's built into us to learn. And so, yes, I think there are assumptions you can make that people have the capacity to learn, how much information they can process. But on the other side, it's the answer might be no, right? Their culture really does matter. And I've told you this story before. A number of years ago, I was in a market in Nairobi, Kenya. And we were having a conversation. I was in this market. The guy I was with was shopping. I was not. And so I was just talking to the shopkeepers, and we got on to the concept of AIDS, of HIV. And I was asking them some questions about, given the prevalence of this in their culture at this particular time, why are certain behaviors still prevalent? And one of them said, well, for a very long time, Swahili had no future tense. So I could talk about our ancestors.
Okay.
I could talk about today. I have no ability to think future because I don't have the ability to talk future. And to me, I mean, that comment left me thinking for months about, it's 20 years ago, but thinking how remarkable that comment was and insightful, but also how much that might change how you think and the choices you make in behavioral science and a whole bunch of other things. If you can't think or talk in the future tense, it's going to profoundly impact how you learn.
Yeah, that's powerful. I mean, I honestly don't remember you telling us that story before. So that's a huge impact. I know in my own experience, I'd done some training in like former what would have been Eastern Bloc communist countries. And even though it was past that point, I was told, like, don't expect feedback, don't expect eye contact, don't expect, because they were trained, a whole generation were trained to sit there, keep your mouth shut, that kind of, right. Which again, thankfully those cultures have rebounded. But that was the nearest example I could think of. But well, I think we're going to take a break.
Okay.
And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of those practical examples you talked about.
Great.
Imagine a world where every training session, every learning module, and every translated document is aligned with your company's unique goals and global ambitions. Welcome to Ingenuity, where we don't just talk about elevating your corporate learning, we make it happen. At Ingenuity, we understand the heart of your business is its people. That's why we specialize in creating custom learning solutions and translation services that are not just effective, but are designed specifically for your business's global needs. Let us show you how learning cannot be just better, but measurably better, with solutions tailored just for you. Learn more in the description below. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. So in the beginning of this podcast, we were talking about what we mean by learning sciences and sort of how that impacts learning globally. But I think one of the things that always seems overwhelming to me, I think about all these learning sciences. I'm not an expert in any one of them. And yet, how am I supposed to pull them all together? And we'll talk more about that as we get into subsequent podcasts. But how do the sciences work together, Jerry? Like, how do they work together to create a better learning experience?
I think each science contributes a certain perspective on the nature of the human person and how he or she will learn. And so I don't think you can carve it up to say, okay, psychology speaks to step 8.
Sure.
Sociology speaks. I think they all have to speak into the entire process, from a needs analysis process to building a learner profile, to doing the design work, to doing the development work, to choosing colors, right? All of those things are going to impact the final learner experience in their particular situation. And so, you have to keep those things in front of you, and be thinking. It's like, a learner profile on steroids. It's not just, here's their demographic information, but, you start getting into more psychographics and you start getting into more, okay, let's look at the full environment in which they're working. Let's look at some of the sociological stuff. Let's look at some of the psychological stuff, linguistics, culture. how are all those things going to impact how what we're creating will be received? That's what I think, and I don't know that you can pick it apart. I think you have to keep that holistic picture in front of you.
Well, I was going to ask then, what you said makes sense, but can you give us a kind of a specific example?
Yeah, I think the one we just all lived through.
Right?
Right, COVID.
Okay, yeah.
COVID immediately, in a matter of weeks, it changed how we work. It changed how we learn. It changed how we train people. And what people found is that moving from the location where they're used to learning into a new location altered how they learned. The sociology, where they were learning in groups, or they were in a small group, or there was more hands-on, and suddenly you're isolated and alone and quasi-depressed, being at home by your right. I mean, the psychological, sociological, and even cognitive stuff at that point, because we'll get into this when we get into cognitive science, but cognition changed because there's, the Amazon guy just showed up. Your dog,
distractions.
right? I mean, you got all this stuff that you're used to doing at home, and you're looking at the refrigerator thinking, did I buy this? Do I need to do that? The washing machine's going. So you're multitasking in a way that you didn't at work. Try to drop learning on top of that.
Yeah.
And it gets complex.
Yeah, well, that calls to mind even one of our colleagues, Lana Jobson, who's going to be on a future podcast, little teaser there, but she talked about like even the psychology of place. Our mind associates, I go to work. And so you're mentally prepared, and there's just certain frameworks you get into when you show up there, but now my
Beyond
place,
habits.
right,
Just
beyond habits, right.
Yeah.
Now my place is different. So that's a whole other topic. But I think you already answered this, but I was going to ask, where do we sort of insert learning science into the process? And, obviously I think it spans the whole process.
I do too, because, in a needs analysis, you better be thinking about this as you're thinking about your learners and objectives and what your objectives will mean to different people. In the design and development phases, my goodness, this is why we localize.
Yeah, right.
Go through the localization process. Even in the United States, we go through the localization process because there are wildly different cultures and different ways of sociologically mixing with each other and engaging with each other. And there's different psychology at work. Take that globally. And I really can't see any spot in there.
Yeah. No.
Where you go, yeah, this doesn't apply here.
Right, which begs the question, and you already addressed it, but I'd love for some practical ideas. Again, I'm an instructional designer sitting at my desk. I have a lot of things I have to take care of, or beyond that, I'm leading a team. And how do I keep these things in front of me practically? What have you seen people do to sort of help them keep learning science in front of them?
I mean, there's a good image to be made of the mixes, but it could be a series of questions. What do your learners already know? That's cognition.
Sure. Right.
And then you got to start thinking about, how am I going to connect this to that? Do my learners have enough time to actually reflect, think?
Yeah.
Are they learning in groups? What's their motivation? Now we're into psychology, right? Sociology. What structures are there? Social structures that are either detracting or reinforcing the learning that you're doing, and scaffolding. How are you going to do that? And so I think there's a bunch of ways, but I've always found when I'm creating something, I have a particular image in my mind of that person in their setting. And sometimes that's really might not work for everybody, but sometimes for me, it's really helpful to go, I'm writing this to this person in this setting, speaking this language with this background. Here's what they already know. And the chances are, if I do what I'm doing well, it'll connect better than if I didn't.
Right. Because I think the visual is really important, whether that's in front of you at your desk or in your mind or whatever. But, well, we barely scratched the surface. So, if we're going to spend the next few episodes digging into each one of these learning sciences, but I thank you for your insight, for giving us a good overview. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Before we wrap up the show, if you're looking to dive deeper, we've got tons of free downloads, L&D resources, and details about upcoming webinars that you won't want to miss. They're found in the episode description. Plus, if you ever want to chat with either one of us, now's your chance. You can find links in the episode description to connect directly with Miriam or me. We're here to answer your questions and to discuss all things learning and development. And speaking of questions, we love hearing from you. Whether it's a question or a comment or a topic you're curious about, or if you just want to join the conversation, drop us a comment on your favorite social media channel. Your input shapes our shows. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. It's the best way to ensure you never miss out on our latest episode. We're excited to continue to transform learning into a measurable success with you. Until next time.